Hello, my name is Aidan Cellini from Sporting News, and joining me is Kieran Francis. And here we are talking about the AFL Trade Period in 2022. To start things off, Kieran, I thought we'd talk about Jason Horne-Francis. He's obviously requested a trade to Port Adelaide, obviously being a South Australian boy, former number one pick in the 2021 draft. How do you think it's going so far? And do you think it's kind of fair that he's requested a trade after only one season?
Yeah, it's an incredible scenario, really. When he was drafted to North Melbourne, did we expect to be talking about him this much 12 months later? It's becoming more of a common thing, players wanting to leave their clubs after being there for not too long. And it is a discussion that I think we'll get to at some point during this chat about Horne-Francis. But yeah, I mean, it was kind of simmering all year. But me personally, I didn't actually think that he would kind of leave in the end. I just thought that it would roll on and, he'd end up staying in the club. And when Alistair Clarkson joined the club, I also thought that maybe that could be enough to get him to stay for a year or so or anything. But now he wants to leave, and Port Adelaide have offered, Port Adelaide have offered pick 8 and a future first so far. Do you think that's a fair deal?
I mean, yeah, look, I think it is. I think Jason Horne-Francis has proven himself a little bit. Unfortunately, obviously, he might have just not loved his time in North Melbourne. I heard his ex-coach, David Noble, actually speak on Trade Radio that he's really invested in the club, but unfortunately just doesn't seem to have worked out. Obviously, hence the trade across back to his home state in South Australia. I think, yeah, pick 8 in the future first round probably will get it done. I think it will satisfy both North Melbourne and Port Adelaide. Obviously, Port Adelaide kind of want to regenerate and bring in some youth. Obviously, Robbie Gray just recently retired, and Travis Bowe's nearing his retirement. And even Ollie Wines as well is kind of getting onto that later end of his career. So obviously adding another midfielder who's obviously 19 years old, has plenty of potential, will obviously be a good thing for for Port Adelaide. Now I just actually saw today that Jason Horne-Francis is actually joining Tom Boyd as the second other player to request a trade after their first year. As we know, Tom Boyd was a highly touted draft pick heading into the Giants at the end of 2013 and took on that lucrative deal at the Western Bulldogs the following year. Obviously, I think it was a 7-year deal worth $1 million a year. Unfortunately for Tom Boyd and for the Bulldogs, he prematurely retired due to mental illness and stuff like that. But he's actually able to land them a premiership in that 2016 draft year, which obviously broke that premiership drought. Moving on, though, what about Luke Jackson? Now, he's obviously been a topic of conversation from probably halfway through the year. Obviously, he's a Western Australian boy. Was pivotal in Melbourne's premiership in 2021. Obviously, 2021 rising star. Also, how do you think his potential destination will go about?
Yeah, well, this one was talked about earlier in the year, but again, we thought, Jackson's having so much success at Melbourne, and when it was being talked about earlier in the year, we thought that Jackson could possibly win, a second flag at Melbourne. But as it went on, it seemed as if he wants to move home, and there's obviously two options: moving back to Western Australia, either being Fremantle or West Coast. And as we can see in that picture, we've got Jackson with Sean Darcy, who's a player that he would be playing with. So yeah, Freo have offered pick 13 and a first, which Melbourne don't appear to be happy with, and West Coast are looking at splitting their splitting pick number 2 into 2 first-round draft picks and sitting in that way. So I guess that's the two options for Jackson. Where do you think he'd suit the best?
It's kind of a hard one to kind of decipher on who we probably prefer to go to or who would suit best. I think potentially Fremantle. I think they're right in that age bracket where obviously they returned to finals this year, won the first final and came up against Collingwood in that semi-final, going down by 20 points. Obviously they've got the likes of Andrew Brayshaw, Caleb Sarong really coming through the ranks. Will Brody came out of nowhere after crossing from Gold Coast as a top 10 draft pick back in their 2016 draft. They've got plenty of defensive mechanisms which allows them to kind of be in games more often than not. Obviously their forward line's kind of let them down a little bit in 2022, but obviously they're looking to work on that. I think Jackson personally would suit brilliantly at Fremantle. Obviously, it'll be tough to decide whether you play Darcy 70-30 in the ruck, because obviously Jackson has the ability to go forward. He's a bit more of a mobile ruckman as opposed to Sean Darcy. Whether Darcy can add a string to his bow and play forward, that's obviously something that Justin Longmuir and the Fremantle coaching staff will have to decide. But yeah, for me, I think Fremantle will probably be more his destination in terms of suitors. Now, another ruckman that's been another big talking point, which could also occur if Luke Jackson does head to Fremantle and or West Coast, is Brody Grundy from Collingwood. Now, Melbourne have actually expressed their interest, and it seems almost locked. How do you see for Brody Grundy and I guess that trade? And also, do you think Collingwood are making a mistake kind of letting him go?
Yeah, well, the Pies obviously struggled through the final series without, I guess, an elite ruckman. Darcy Cameron's done a brilliant job, and obviously Mason Cox as well. But it seemed like an elite ruckman might have actually helped them through that preliminary final. I mean, I suppose they did get pretty close, regardless of that Grundy. There wasn't much in it between making the grand final anyway. But yeah, it is quite interesting because Collingwood seem to be on the up. I think it all stems around the fact that they probably committed for too long and paid too much money for him in the end. He's probably, I mean, he was an elite ruckman. But I want to pass something to you before we talk about it more. Do you think that he possibly, Grundy's maybe feeling a bit of burnout? He started at a really young age and was kind of straight into the ruck as a senior ruck at a very young age and has played a lot of football. And do you feel as if in the past couple of years there has been a bit of burnout there?
Potentially, yeah, I think I do. Obviously, backing on those 2018, 2019 seasons, all Australian, probably taking the mantle as the number one ruckman in the competition, probably rivaling that with Max Gawn. Obviously that's when he signed this lucrative 7-year deal at Collingwood. Given the fact that he's a South Australian boy and Port Adelaide and other clubs were circling for his signature at the time. But yeah, obviously that 2020 year was very difficult for everyone involved, not just AFL players and the like. Obviously, COVID impacted, had a fair effect on people. And reports would say that players really struggled to kind of enjoy their normal life. They were just, kind of stuck in hubs and playing games, with 3, 4, 5 day breaks. And although that now is 2 seasons ago, it can still have kind of a crippling effect even now. And I'm not saying that's in its entirety that it's affected his way he's played. But obviously, in 2020, 2021, he couldn't really hit his stride and potential. He's really good at not only just rucking and guiding the ball down to his rovers, but he's very good at, that follow-up, which obviously a lot of ruckmen aren't able to do. And it's kind of this new age ruckman, which we've seen Luke Jackson and as well kind of adopt that type of mold, so to speak. And 2022, he actually started really well. I mean, statistically, the Pies were actually quite impressive. They were up there toward the clearances in their first 5 or 6 rounds. Ironically, when they go out, they were 14th after he went out, and for the rest of the season, they were 14th ranked 14th in clearances for the rest of 2022, which kind of says how good he can be and is in that Collingwood outfit. But potentially the burnout could have been the case for Brody Grundy. Do you think pick 27, which Melbourne recently received from Port Adelaide, I believe it was, who gave up picks 33, 43, and 53 for pick 27, do you think that gets it done for Collingwood?
We've got to get used to this new idea that the picks, obviously only mean as much as the salary that's coming across. As we're going to talk about Jack Bowes later, it's a salary dump him moving to Geelong. And I guess it's a very similar thing with Grundy going to Melbourne. I mean, there's talk that Collingwood could be paying $300,000 a season for Grundy over the next, say, I think it's 5 years left of the deal. So, which is nearly enough for a decent probably squad player. 300K a year. I think Blake Acres is actually on $1 million over 3 years, which is pretty much 300K a year. So, yeah, it's quite interesting. But I think that a pick around that mark does get it done if, Collingwood are going to be paying that amount of money. But, I mean, maybe if the money's reduced to less, then they can get a better pick. Yeah, I'm not sure. So, I know that Collingwood have turned down that, but I think it will probably be around that mark. I guess it just depends how much money Collingwood are going to be paying. And it's quite an extraordinary situation down at Collingwood because, they're also paying quite a bit of Treloar's contract as well. So, I mean, it's almost probably one elite player between Grundy and Treloar a season that they're going to be paying to other clubs. And they're obviously had a pretty good season, Collingwood. So, I imagine if they had that money to spend on a player for themselves, it could make the club even better. In terms of Melbourne, how do you see Grundy fitting in at Melbourne?
Personally, I love the move from Melbourne. It was quite aggressive. Obviously, losing Luke Jackson to one of the WA sides, as we said before, potentially Fremantle more so than West Coast. I think, it's not necessarily a part and parcel. Obviously, Grundy is more predominantly ruck, in my opinion. I didn't really see him trialled forward as at Collingwood throughout his time there since being drafted. I think it was in 2013 or 2012. But yeah, I think Grundy coming in will allow Gawn to kind of spend more of his time up forward. As we saw this year, he was a bit battered and bruised. Gawn, he was quite fatigued. He was constantly carrying injuries, if not sitting out of games because of injuries, allowing him to go up forward and not necessarily rest his body, but give himself a chance to take a breather, attack the ball in the air, and then go into the ruck once, opposition teams have to deal with Brody Grundy, who's arguably, one of the top 3 ruckmans of the last 4, 5, 6 years, to then have to attack Max Gawn, who will then go into the ruck coming from the forward line. I think it's a perfect mix. And obviously Simon Goodwin has come out previously in the past saying the 2 ruckmen, I guess, setup that they have gone for the last couple of years and have strived to go for is something that they will constantly want to work with and for. Now, whether or not they happen to turn Brody Grundy into a bit of a forward ruck and maybe Max Gawn kind of allow him to sit more forward, I don't know, we'll see kind of next year if obviously this trade does go through. But that is definitely an interesting one. Now, moving on to Josh Dunkley. Now, he's a very interesting one. Obviously, just won the 2022 Best and Fairest at the Western Bulldogs, but he's requested a trade to the Brisbane Lions. Let's give us your thoughts on that move.
Yeah, well, I mean, he's definitely going to add to the Lions midfield. We saw in the final series and maybe the latter stage of the season that Brisbane relied a lot on Lachie Neale doing the clearances, especially when Jared Lyons went out of the team with injury. And a bit of a strange one with Lyons because he kind of tailed off toward the back end of the year and then was fending himself out of the team and couldn't get back in. So I'm not sure what type of injury he has, but it doesn't seem to be too good, maybe a chronic type of injury. So whether Jared Lyons will come back as strong, we obviously hope to see he will. But they really lacked in the clearances. We saw Jared Berry step up a fair bit, but that obviously wasn't enough. And the Lions need players like Cam Rayner to come through, but he's another one that I don't think is ready to play, 75, 80% midfield yet in wing clearances. He probably needs to work on his fitness. He also probably needs to work on his craft around the stoppages as well. So yeah, it's an interesting situation. I think that he is suited to the Lions. He'll definitely add a bow to their forward line when he rests forward because we've seen he's a really tough matchup. He can take a mark, he can kick a goal at ground level, and it was real interesting that he kind of won the Dogs Best and Fairest, and he also led their Brownlow votes as well. So there was no doubt he was the best player at the Bulldogs this season. Is that he didn't really play like a lot of midfield time. Like he'd spent a fair bit of time there, but he wasn't spending, like 85, 75% of the time in the midfielders like a lot of midfielders do. He was spending a lot of time at forward, and because the Bulldogs had such a strong midfield group, he's obviously getting rotated in and out. So, yeah, I mean, the Lions, are going to do anything to win a flag. They talked about Buddy Franklin earlier on the season as being a possible option. And, so Dunkley's going to add to their group. And, I mean, in theory, if he brings what he's brought the last couple of seasons, he definitely improves the group. And he's a pretty similar type of player to Neale. Maybe they're missing a player that can kind of, burst away from stoppages. I mean, Dunkley will have goals when he rests forward and stuff and everything. But, yeah, I mean, if Jared Lyons is not going to get back to his best, we hope he does, then, Dunkley can, slide in the team as that, I wouldn't say back up to Neale because Dunkley's a good player, but, as that second contested ball in the midfield. So, yeah, and do you think it'll be a big loss for the Dogs?
I personally don't, unfortunately. Sorry, Josh Dunkley, if you're listening to this, or any Josh Dunkley fans. Look, as we've mentioned, he had a great season. It has been a great player, and he debuted in that 2016 season when they won that premiership. It's kind of like a workhorse, just puts his body constantly on the line. But what his, I guess, departure will allow is kind of free up another spot in that midfield. Now, we know the Bulldogs have probably, and arguably, the strongest midfield in the competition. You've got Tom Liberatore, you've got Jack McRae, Marcus Bontempelli, Adam Treloar, Bailey Smith is now coming into that midfield. And they've got another kind of a group of small forwards to kind of go through there, just to mix things up, as Luke Beveridge likes to do. Josh Dunkley, as we have, though, mentioned, he can play forward and midfield. Predominantly, he would love to play midfield and rest forward, which, as we know, he probably wasn't getting that at the Western Bulldogs, which is why the move probably makes sense for his career. But this probably will allow more time for the midfielders like Adam Treloar, who is that burst player, to really get away from stoppages. That I think we've spoken about it before, that 60, 70, 80-metre play, carrying the ball 10, 15 metres, potentially even taking the bounce. I remember when he used to play for Collingwood, he'd really break open the lines and, carry that ball 100 metres and get the ball over the defensive, I guess, pressure and set, and allow that ball to go over the top and onto their foot and onto the teammates into the forward line. And allowing players like, as I said, Treloar and Bontempelli to kind of go a bit more on the outside and let Liberatore and McRae kind of do the grunt work, the hard work, which Dunkley would do at times when he went through the midfield. Again, it just kind of balances a little bit more. Now, I'm sure they'll probably receive a fair bit of compensation for Dunkley, given the fact that he was quite a handy player for the Bulldogs and obviously just won their best and fairest. So I wouldn't be, in my opinion, I think it's probably a win, I guess, potentially for both sides. Obviously, the Dogs would have loved to have kept him, but from a balance perspective, I think that's probably the right way to go. Now, as recently as today, Jack Bowes has announced that he'd prefer to go to Geelong. Obviously, this is quite a big talking point in the trade from the start of this week, if not maybe a little bit before, with Gold Coast obviously combining their current pick 7 to kind of get Jack Bowes off their salary, ease their salary cap and get him off their books. How do you see that kind of Jack Bowes trade going down? Is it a good thing for Geelong? Should other clubs have gone a bit harder for Bowes? What are your thoughts about it?
Can we not make Geelong any better, please? Like they just won the flag. Like they just won the flag with the oldest team of all time. Like, and they're and they're all about precision kicking and stuff. So let's bring in one of the best precision kickers in the AFL and into the team, and we'll also give them pick 7 as well for it. Why not? Hey, no, I think it's a great trade for Geelong. Like, they've got players like Tui and Isaac Smith, and that are probably not going to play forever and playing in the wing halfback area. Jack Bowes was really highly rated, and he hasn't kind of reached the heights that we've expected. But what we have seen is he's a great kick. So, and we've seen lots of players flourish in that environment at Geelong who have sort of got second chances, such as Stengel and stuff. So, I mean, getting him I think would have been a great pickup for a lot of clubs. I think he's got a fair ceiling, and Gold Coast obviously needed to get rid of him because of the salary cap issue, and he came with pick 7. So, I mean, Geelong, I think I read that it'll be their lowest pick since they drafted Selwood, which is incredible because Selwood's retiring. So 7 is their lowest pick which would have been 2006, I think. So their lowest pick in 16 years. So it allowed Geelong to keep doing what they're doing. And I think it's a great move for the Cats. And I think he'll slot into that team, whether that be halfback or wing, maybe even back pocket. Yeah, there's a number of roles he can play, but it's for me, it's a good trade for both clubs.
Absolutely. Now, a confirmed deal that went through, I believe it was on Monday, was Tim Taranto. Now, I think we all knew that was probably going to happen. He nominated Richmond a fair few weeks ago, but the trade was confirmed on Monday, and the Tigers sent through picks 12 and 19 for Taranto services. Who do you think won that trade?
I don't know. Hey, Taranto's a good player. I'm not sure that he is a superstar. So I think that Jacob Hopper has more. This is just a personal opinion. I think Jacob Hopper's got more, a bigger ceiling in my opinion. Taranto is a good footballer. He won the Giants best and fairest in 2019. Since then, he's kind of hasn't really gone forward at all. Obviously, the COVID year was difficult for everyone. And I guess the Giants have declined and everything, but he sort of stagnated. He was used a bit last season and a bit this season as a hybrid forward when Toby Green wasn't playing. And I think one game he kicked 4 goals, but apart from that, he didn't really have a huge amount of impact as a forward. He's got some interesting stats. He was first in the league for total clearances in 2019. He was 4th in 2021. And then this season, he was 12th for clangers per game this season, which shows that he obviously gets a lot of the football, but maybe he's not making the best decisions as well. So I think that he's a really good pickup for Richmond. But 2 first-round picks is a big price to pay. So, we've seen Geelong go down this route of trying to regenerate, and it's been pretty successful for them. We've seen Hawthorn do it, and we see it hasn't really worked out. So hopefully for Richmond's sake, trading away these high draft picks is worth it for them. But for me, Jacob Hopper is the player. He averaged 6 clearances a game last season. This year he was obviously struggled with injuries, and we look at Richmond's team, and their midfield is one of their big issues. Is winning clearances. They rely on Prestia a lot, and players such as Jack Graham and Jack Ross maybe haven't developed enough. So I think that Taranto and Hopper are assuming they get Hopper, are definitely a step up on those players. But it's a huge price to pay. Maybe that price for Hopper is a bit fair. In terms of Hopper, do you think that he'll be a good move if he goes to Richmond?
Yeah, I think both. It's almost a masterclass move from the Tigers. I know they did give up a fair bit to get Taranto. I think it's a perfect way to regenerate this. Obviously, Dustin Martin throughout 2022 had his struggles. I think he played up until round 8, then took some personal time, had a lot of ongoing injuries that just kind of couldn't seem to get to his best. Obviously returned for that first final against Brisbane and just couldn't really get up. Prestia also missed a few games, and he's also getting toward the end of his career. I think adding both Taranto and Hopper is the perfect move for Richmond. As we know, offensively, they're I think behind maybe Brisbane and Melbourne. I'm not Melbourne, sorry, Brisbane and Geelong. They're probably the second or third best attacking team in 2022. I mean, obviously you've got Tom Lynch, Shai Bolton probably having 4 or 5 shots on goal a game, Jack Riewoldt as well. Just to name a few, obviously you've got Dustin Martin, a sensational player. And then defensively, they just continue to have this kind of sound mechanism where it's not just a one-on-one defense. They defend as a team and as a unit. The midfielders get back and help quite well. And as I said, gives their team chances to get in winning positions. But their midfield probably lacked this year. Obviously, the absence of Martin, Cochin is probably slowing down as well, as we know, probably nearing retirement too, and Prestia. And, you got Graham still coming through. I think he's 24 years old. Shai Bolton is arguably the most easily watched player and most excited player to watch, in the AFL, and could be, one of the game's best players in the coming years. He's still got plenty of upside. And these inclusions of Hopper and Taranto who do that grunt work and have done so at the Giants for the last few years, kind of complements the Richmond midfield perfectly, in my opinion. Obviously, you've got Dustin Martin, who uses the ball brilliantly, can take that ball from the inside to the outside very quickly. Obviously, Shai Bolton, very much the same. And these players will allow Taranto and Hopper to, again, do that grunt work, get in and under, dish out the handballs, or, get those clearances, get the ball travelling forward to allow the Richmond Football Club to actually put scores on the board and pressure. So I honestly think it's one of the best moves the Richmond Footy Club have made and could have made this whole trade period. I mean, as you mentioned, Geelong kind of do this regenerating where they're kind of just taking high talented players on the move to make sure they're kind of relevant in that premiership race. As we know, Richmond just missed out by, I think it was 2 points they lost to Brisbane in that elimination final. And people actually had them tipped to make a prelim, if not really cause some damage and potentially make a grand final this year, which obviously, unfortunately for Tigers fans, didn't occur. But I just think it's definitely a big move. Although they did pay a hefty price for Taranto, and it looks like they probably will for Hopper. I think it's obviously a great move for the club itself. Now, Collingwood. Now, Collingwood's obviously a big name player, big AFL club, probably the biggest in the land. They've been very, very busy. Obviously, they're potentially trying to offload Brody Grundy. They recently signed Jordan De Goey for 5 years, but they've also been mentioned with 5 names. Now, we've talked about Daniel Mcstate, Bobby Hill have recently signed at the club, but also there's a few other players as well that they're kind of keen on. Who are they, Kieran?
Yeah, there's Billy Frampton, who actually, we've got a comment about Billy Frampton from Dan John saying, I think Grundy leaving is a mistake. Frampton isn't much chop, so we'll discuss Billy Frampton in a second, but also Braden Fiorini and Tom Mitchell have been linked with the Pies as well. But I'm actually a big fan of Billy Frampton. He didn't play much last season. I'm pretty sure it was because Adelaide knew he wasn't going to sign a new contract, so they decided to use Murray and Jordan Butts and kind of blood those players instead of, I guess, putting time into Frampton, who was exceptional in the first 8 games. He was taking 7-8 intercept marks a game. He's really tall. He uses the ball quite well. And I actually think he's going to be a top inclusion to Collingwood's defence, which at times looked undersized. No one's fault, just Jeremy Howe's undersized as a defender who did a magnificent job. And Frampton at 202 centimetres tall, he can hold down a key post and allow Jeremy Howe to also, play more as that third up defender. And I think he's a magnificent addition. In terms of Fiorini and Mitchell, how do you think that, assuming that they come in, how do you think that they can improve the Collingwood midfield?
Yeah, well, I think initially it just adds depth immediately. Obviously, Collingwood had a lot of youth coming through, especially for that midfield. They tried Pendlebury through the half back. Sidebottom was, kept to the wing. But, they had Jordan De Goey, who was going through their Taylor Adams. They had to trial Jack Crisp there, who actually turned out to be, again, another masterclass from Craig McRae and the Collingwood coaching staff. Obviously won the second best and fair second Copeland Trophy consecutively. But after, when Taylor Adams went down, they had to bring in the likes of Josh Carmichael, Cal Brown, got to look in a few times. Tyler Brown was also earlier on, which they're handy players and they're good depth players, but not necessarily up to the AFL standards, against the likes of like a Patrick Dangerfield, a Joel Selwood, even like a Luke Parker from Sydney. These players can't really go up against maybe the higher end players of the competition. But Tom Mitchell is the 2018 Brownlow medalist for Hawthorn. His game style would actually is probably what Collingwood are missing. Obviously, as I mentioned earlier, they ranked 14th in clearances in 2022 for the entire season, and that's because they just couldn't get their hands first on the ball. Now, Craig McRae's game style, they relied heavily on pressure. If they don't get to the ball, they're making sure the next one's there to cause a turnover and then slingshot back. But if Collingwood can initially win that ball and allow themselves to not have their defence be put under pressure and get the ball forward, it kind of makes them kind of a two-pronged club where they have two aspects of their game they can actually score heavily on. Tom Mitchell obviously adds to that, his ability to find the ball inside. I think he still averages well over 20 disposals a game for Hawthorn. Even though you wouldn't know, he's known for his cheeky little handballs, his clearances, his contested possessions are through the roof. So definitely would be a handy inclusion if the Pies can get that deal done. And Fiorini just adds another layer of depth. He has gone through the midfield. He can go on the wing. He's got I'm pretty sure, quite an accurate left foot. Just fallen out of favour, unfortunately, at the Suns. And, for his career, he probably would like to move on. But, yeah, I think for those two, definitely it would be definitely a handy inclusion for the Pies. And obviously probably for both their individual careers, it also might be a good move for them. Now, Daniel Mcstate has been a big, big talking point. Obviously, people are getting confused between the fact that Collingwood are getting rid of Grundy to kind of bring in Mcstate. Obviously, there's a few other things to kind of factor in. But does Mcstate bring – what does Mcstate bring to Collingwood's lineup in 2023?
I wonder if Collingwood would still be going for Mcstate if they didn't have such a successful year, I guess. I think Dan Mcstate is extremely similar to Brody Grundy in almost every way. He's a tough worker. He'll work all day. He'll work up and down the ground. He'll make a contest. But is he going to kick enough goals? I think there's room for one of those type of players in the team. Mychik does a brilliant job, and he's made an AFL career out of almost nothing. But Dan Mcstate, I think his career best is 30 goals in a season, which is not brilliant for a key forward, really. It's just over one a game. And, Collingwood were obviously desperate for key forward help, but they kind of figured out a way to make what they had work last season really well. I'm not saying that they can't use a key forward, but, Mcstate was pretty much – it was a thing that he was coming to Collingwood pretty much before Collingwood started to have their success last season. So I think that they're definitely going to get a hard-working player, a player, but is he going to be a player that's going to turn Collingwood, from a preliminary final team into a grand final team? It's obviously a fine line. And Collingwood had a really good season last year, but is it fair to say they possibly overachieved a little bit? It's hard to tell. That they won so many games in a row by so little margin. If one or two of those games go the opposite way, they're down the ladder a bit, and that's not taking anything away from them because you've got to be an extraordinary team to do that. But it's such a fine line, and for Collingwood to continue to be up there, they need to. It looks like they've made some good moves. Bobby Hill, he's going to slot into the forward alongside Jamie Elliott, Jack Ginnivan, and Bo McCreary. Hill alongside those three smalls. That's a smorgasbord of smalls. You've got ones that can mark, you've got ones that can finish. You got ones like McCreary who can provide extreme pressure. I still think Bobby Hill needs to lift a bit. He's had a pretty good career, but maybe hasn't, we haven't seen enough good from him yet. But I think Collingwood gave up what was fair and he can go to a different level and everything. So, yeah, I think things are looking really good for Collingwood. As you said about Fiorini and Mitchell, midfield has been a weak point. It didn't help missing Taylor Adams through the final series. Maybe another couple of midfielders possibly could have got them over the line. I've just got a question here from Damon Davrain. He just says, Melbourne need a key forward. Who should they target? Aidan, any ideas? Let's talk about the Melbourne forward line in terms of how it functions. We know that Grundy is probably going to come in, but who would you think that Melbourne could possibly target?
Well, I think that at the moment, they probably wouldn't have targeted a forward as such. Obviously this year their forward woes were quite obvious to the naked eye and to supporters and the AFL world. Bailey Fritsch up there, I think he kicked 50 goals for the season. I don't think it's necessarily a key forward. Obviously Ben Brown last year, actually, he had a fair final series and leading up to it as well. He performed to that level that a key forward would. So he has the potential. He did it for plenty of years at North Melbourne. which was actually a surprise to me why North Melbourne actually let him go. But he has that ability to be that key forward. If he doesn't mark it, he brings it to ground. He takes the ball at the highest point, which makes it extremely difficult for defenders to actually kind of spoil the ball and knock it out of his hands. He finishes off his work. I think it's just more Melbourne just need to refresh. Obviously adding or losing Jackson, but probably adding Grundy and allowing Gawn to play more forward. We'll probably add that tall. They just really need to hone in on that. Obviously, they got Wiedemann probably still at the club potentially at this point anyway, to our knowledge. I think they just got to work with what they've got at the moment. I think Gawn, Fritsch and Brown can definitely provide enough tools and enough kind of scoring power and aerial presence for me anyway, to allow Melbourne to kind of get right back into that premiership contention. I mean, obviously they went out in straight sets, but they just looked bad in the bruise. I think Petrarca himself alone was injured carrying to the final series, and they all kind of just looked a bit tired. And it's hard to get on top, but it's also even harder to stay on top even longer. So I think that Gawn, Fritsch, Brown definitely, in my eyes, can do enough. But it's just the service, the connection between the midfield and the forward line at times. I think we saw Clayton Oliver and Petrarca kind of just bomb it forward and just allow interceptors to kind of do their thing, opposition interceptors to do their thing. But yeah, I think Melbourne will be in a good spot next year. So Demons fans do get around them. I think they're definitely going to be up there and potentially finish top four again. I mean, they only finished second this year. Unfortunately, did bow out in straight sets. But is there anyone in your mind, Kieran, that you could think of for Melbourne?
Yeah, I mean, I put you on the spot a bit there, didn't I? But I guess I don't think they're going to look for a key forward. I think that they'll I think Tom McDonald can definitely come through and play. He obviously was injured a fair bit and would have made a bit of a difference. It certainly is a big issue for the Demons. Like Bradley Fritsch is a great player, and as you said, Ben Brown's a workhorse, and Cozzy Pickett will chip in with some goals. But it certainly is the most, when I say dysfunctional, I don't mean in a bad way. It's just that their midfield and their defense is the best in the competition, and it works in incredible ways that we don't see from other teams. And their midfield, as we know, is Gawn, Oliver, Petrarca. Like it's incredible. So their forward line is definitely their least functional part of the ground. We saw they were struggling to find another small forward to come up alongside Pickett. We saw Melksham play some really good football in their spot. So it definitely wasn't the most settled place in the team. And Sam Wiedemann, high draft pick, has shown some signs, but he can't seem to get any momentum. He can't seem to, when he plays, to be fair, he hasn't demanded a spot either. So, maybe he needs a move. Maybe he needs to slim down a little bit. I just think that, not that he's fat, but he's just too bulky. Maybe a bit not agile enough for a key forward. You need to have your key forwards need to be able to put pressure on to chase and tackle as well. And Wiedemann's a big boy, so maybe he should consider. It's almost like he's been, looking to make himself the number one banana, the big four, but maybe he needs to be, kind of change his body size to be more of a backup forward and be more mobile. And so in terms of the Ds, I think that maybe they might take one in the draft, but I don't think that they'll bring one in from another club. Obviously, Grundy and Gawn will spend time forward next season. Whether Grundy succeeds in the forward, I don't know. The only moment that I can think when he did was when, is it Grundy? Yes, it's Grundy. When he knocked off Richmond in that game, took that big, I don't think he marked it, but he pulled it down in the goal square. And so it's going to be interesting to see, but I think the Ds will stick to what they've got in the forward line.
Absolutely. Well, we've got a very interesting trade period, obviously just starting on Monday and actually going to next Wednesday. But for Hear Us Now, from Sporting News, my name's Aidan, and with me is Kieran Francis. Have a good night, and I'm sure we'll see you all guys soon. See ya.